The Whitmore family believed in legacy, not luck. I understood that before I ever stepped in the private dining room at the Grand Monarch Hotel. Harrison had tried to prepare me for the evening, but preparation only goes so far when you are walking into a room that has already decided what you are. Crystal chandeliers hung above us like silent witnesses. The table stretched long and polished, reflecting silverware so sharply it looked like rows of small weapons. I could feel eyes on me before I even took my seat. Harrison squeezed my hand under the table. "You're going to be fine," he whispered, almost a small smile. I wasn't afraid of them. I was afraid of what I might have to reveal. Across from me sat Vivian Caldwell, Harrison's aunt, the family's unofficial gatekeeper. Her posture was flawless, her pearls perfectly aligned at her collarbone. She studied me as if I were a contract she suspected of hidden clauses. "So," she began lightly, swirling her wine. "Alara, Harrison tells us you're from Montana." "Yes," I replied. "A small town outside Bozeman." "How charming," she said, the word wrapped in something colder than politeness. "It must be quite an adjustment. From open fields to private equity." A few quiet chuckles rippled down the table. I kept my voice steady. "Every environment teaches you something. I've learned a lot in both." Vivian tilted her head. "I imagine you have." Dinner progressed in carefully measured exchanges. Questions about my education, my work, my parents. Each inquiry felt less like curiosity and more like excavation. Then she set down her fork. "I've always found it interesting," she said, addressing no one and everyone at once, "how ambition gravitates towards stability. Especially when that stability includes generational trusts, jets, and portfolios." The air shifted. Harrison's hand tightened around mine. "I'm not sure I understand," he said, tension edging his voice. Vivian smiled. "I'm sure you do." Silence pressed in from all sides. I could feel the assumption forming: the girl from Montana, the public schools, the scholarship law degree. They saw a narrative that fit too neatly. Harrison looked at me, waiting. "Defend yourself. Say something," but I didn't. Because anything I said would reduce this to their story about me. And I had not come here to play a supporting character in my own plan. Vivian leaned back, satisfied. "We've seen it before," she continued. "People who fall in love with what comes attached." There it was, gold digger. She didn't need to say the words. I met her gaze. "Is that what you think this is?" I asked quietly. "I think," she replied, "that history teaches us to be careful." I almost laughed at that. History. If only she knew how much of it I carried. Harrison finally spoke, his voice firmer. "Aunt Vivian, that's enough." But the damage had already been delivered. Not loud, not crude, just precise. I let the silence stretch, let them sit with their assumption. What none of them understood was that I had researched every Whitmore subsidiary before I ever agreed to that first date. I knew the year Whitmore Capital pulled funding from mid-sized construction firms across the Midwest. I knew the acquisition trail that followed. I knew the names of the shell companies, and I knew exactly which executive signature authorized those withdrawals. Vivian's. She thought I wanted access to their wealth. She had no idea I wanted access to their records. Dessert arrived untouched. The family conversation drifted back to safer territory, but the verdict lingered in the room. I was tolerated, not welcomed. When the dinner ended, Harrison walked me to the lobby. "I'm sorry," he said. "She can be protective." "Protective of what?" I asked. I studied him. He didn't know. The sincerity in his eyes was real. That was the complication. "I can handle suspicion," I told him. "I just don't handle dishonesty well." He frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means," I said softly, "that sometimes people accuse others of what they're afraid will be uncovered." His expression shifted. "Uncovered." I stepped closer, brushing imaginary lint from his jacket just to steady myself. "Harrison, has your aunt ever talked to you about the restructuring phase 15 years ago? The rural divestments?" His brows pulled together. "That was before I joined the board." "Why?" "Just curious," I said, forcing a small smile. "I like to understand the full picture." He nodded slowly. But doubt had entered his posture. As I stepped into the elevator alone, my reflection stared back at me in the mirrored walls. They saw a gold digger. What they didn't see was the folder saved on my encrypted drive. The archived board minutes. The property transfers. the withdrawal notices signed during Vivian's temporary executive control. And one of those withdrawal notices had destroyed my father's company. As the elevator doors began to close, my phone vibrated. An unknown number. A single message appeared on the screen: "Stop digging. Some legacies are buried for a reason." The doors sealed shut. And suddenly, this was no longer just about suspicion. The elevator didn't move right away. It hovered for a second, like the building itself needed time to decide whether to carry me upward or swallow me whole. I stared at the message again, the words sharp as a blade pressed gently against skin. "Stop digging. Some legacies are buried for a reason." My reflection in the mirrored wall looked too calm for what I felt. The hotel lighting softened everything: cheekbones, eyes, even fear. But the fear was there, buried behind discipline. I slid the phone into my coat pocket, like it was something fragile. And finally the elevator began to rise. Harrison's voice still echoed in my head from the lobby. Protective of us. I almost wanted to turn back, to ask him whether he'd ever seen this side of his family. This side that didn't speak in threats out loud, because they'd learned how to make their cruelty look like manners. But the threat didn't start tonight. Tonight was just the first time it wore my name. The moment the elevator doors opened onto the quiet corridor, the sound of the dinner room vanished. Plush carpet muted footsteps. Everything felt designed to keep conflict invisible. I walked toward my suit without rushing, because rushing would have admitted fear. Inside, I locked the door, set my bag down, and finally let my shoulders drop. Then I pulled my phone back out. Unknown number. No caller ID, no traceable name. My thumb hovered over the screen. I didn't reply. I didn't call. I didn't give them the satisfaction of knowing they'd gotten under my skin. Instead, I walked to the window and looked down at the street, where traffic flowed like nothing in the world ever broke. That was how it had looked. My father lost everything too. The world moving. People buying coffee. Cars stopping at lights. As if bankruptcy was just a private inconvenience, not a public execution. I was 19 when I watched him sign away the final pieces of his company, in a courthouse hallway that smelled like paper and cold disinfectant. The kind of smell that clung to your clothes and followed you home. He stood with a pen in his hand, staring down at the documents. His shoulders were broad from years of hauling materials, building foundations, taking pride in work that actually existed in the world. But that day his shoulders looked smaller, like a weight had pressed them inward. "Alara," he said, voice low, careful. "I need you to understand something." "What?" I asked. My hands were shaking, and I hated that I couldn't stop it. He didn't look at me right away. He stared at the paperwork like it had personally betrayed him. "Sometimes people don't lose because they're weak," he said. "Sometimes they lose because someone else decided they should." I swallowed hard. "Who decided that?" His jaw tightened. "Whitmore Capital pulled the funding." That name landed like a heavy object dropped in water. The ripples spread instantly through my chest, through my thoughts, through every part of me that still believed business was about merit. "They can't just do that," I said. "Not weeks before completion." He let out a humorless breath. "They can." And they did. My father had secured a major contract for a regional development project. It was supposed to change everything: new equipment, more workers, steady income. The funding was signed, the milestones were met, the project was nearly finished. And then, without warning, the money stopped. No explanation, no call, no meeting. Just silence. The bank didn't care why. The contractors didn't care why. The deadlines didn't care why. The machine kept turning, and my father, who had built everything with his hands, was suddenly treated like a problem that needed to be removed. In that courthouse hallway, the opposing attorney spoke to him with a calm that felt rehearsed. "This is standard restructuring," the attorney said. "Your situation is unfortunate, but it isn't personal." I still hear my father's laugh, quiet and broken. "Not personal," he repeated, almost to himself, as if he was tasting the lie. When we got outside afterward, he stood on the courthouse steps and looked up at the sky like he expected it to answer him. "They won't even tell me why," he said. "They won't even give me the dignity of a reason." That was what poisoned him. Not just the loss. The silence. The way powerful people could erase you and keep their hands clean. Over the next year, the stress carved into him. The doctors warned him his blood pressure was dangerous, that his heart was under strain, that he needed rest. But rest costs money. Treatments cost money. And we had none. When he died, it wasn't dramatic. No heroic last words. Just a slow fading that felt like watching a house collapse beam by beam. Knowing you can't stop it. I didn't grow up resenting wealth. I grew up resenting the way wealth hid behind paperwork and called it morality. That resentment didn't turn into rage. It turned into focus. I went to law school, corporate law, financial compliance. I learned the language that let people do harm and still sleep at night. I learned the loopholes they called strategy. I learned how to read board minutes like crime scenes. And during graduate research, I found a pattern that made my stomach go cold. Whitmore Capital had pulled funding from multiple mid-sized family-run businesses, often in rural regions. Often just before project completion, then those businesses collapsed. Their land assets absorbed by shell companies with names that didn't mean anything until you followed the ownership chain. It wasn't always illegal. That was the worst part. It was designed to sit just inside the borders of legality, where morality couldn't testify, so I started collecting proof. Slowly, meticulously, quietly, I told myself it was about justice, and it was. But it was also about dignity, about refusing to let my father's story be reduced to a line item labeled unfortunate outcome. Years later, when I walked into that philanthropic gala, and saw the name Harrison Whitmore on a sponsor banner, my chest tightened the way it had in that courthouse hallway. Then I saw him. He wasn't polished cruelty like Vivian. He wasn't smug entitlement. He was listening to a rural organizer with a seriousness that didn't feel performative. When he spoke, it wasn't about branding. It was about repair. "You're actually doing this work?" I asked him that night, cautious. He looked straight at me. "If we're going to cough it from the world, we owe the world something back." The sincerity unsettled me more than suspicion would have. Because sincerity complicated plans. I told myself I had two options. Avoid him entirely, keep chasing the truth from a distance, or move closer and finally see what lived inside the Whitmore name now. I chose proximity not for revenge, but for clarity. But as the relationship grew, as his kindness stayed consistent, I found myself questioning a terrifying possibility. What if the rot wasn't him? What if the rot belonged to the people who raised him? Who shaped the company before he ever had a vote? Back in my suite, I opened my laptop and stared at the folder. I kept encrypted under layers of passwords. I didn't need to look to know what was inside. I had memorized the signatures, the dates, the transfer chains, and one name sat at the center of it like a spider in an immaculate web. Vivian Caldwell. My phone buzzed again, same unknown number. This time, it wasn't a message. It was a photo. A courthouse hallway. My courthouse hallway, and at the bottom corner of the frame, barely visible but undeniable, was a familiar pearl bracelet, Vivian's wrist, captured in the background, standing close enough to my father that she could heard every word he said that day. If Vivian had been there when my father lost everything, then her gold digger accusation wasn't just an insult, it was a warning from someone who already knew exactly who I was. I didn't sleep the night I received the courthouse photo. I lay in the dark hotel suite, staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail in the image. The angle. The lighting. The unmistakable curve of Vivian Caldwell's pearl bracelet. She hadn't just orchestrated financial withdrawals from a boardroom. She had stood feet away from my father as his life's work was dismantled. She had watched. The next morning, Harrison called before I could gather my thoughts. "I've been thinking about last night," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "About what my aunt implied." "So have I." I answered carefully. "I don't want you feeling like you're under a microscope," he continued. "You don't deserve that." The irony almost choked me. I was under far more than a microscope. "Harrison," I said, keeping my tone measured. "Can I ask you something without you getting defensive?" "Of course." "During your father's last years leading the company, who had signing authority when he was ill?" There was a pause on the line. "Not long, but long enough." "Vivian stepped in temporarily," he said. "Why?" "I'm trying to understand the structure," I replied. "Just the structure." He exhaled slowly. You ask questions like an auditor. That bothers you. No, he said. It makes me think you care. He believed he had fallen in love with resilience. With discipline. With someone unimpressed by wealth. He didn't see the layers beneath it. But Vivian did. Within weeks of the dinner, subtle shifts began happening around me. Invitations rerouted. Conversations paused when I entered rooms at corporate events. One afternoon, Harrison mentioned casually that his aunt had commissioned a routine background review. To protect the family. A routine review? I asked. She does it with anyone who gets close. He said. It's not personal. Everything in their world was personal. It just wore professional clothing. The report came back clean. Harrison told me that himself, almost proudly. No debt. No red flags. No hidden investors, he said. She didn't find anything. Did she seem satisfied? I asked. He hesitated. Not exactly. That unsettled me more than if she had found dirt. Because in Vivian's mind, someone like me should have had visible flaws. A gold digger should leave fingerprints. The absence of them meant I was something else. While she searched my past, I dug into hers. Through legal research channels and publicly accessible corporate archives, I began reconstructing transaction timelines. I compared funding withdrawals with subsequent land acquisitions. I cross-referenced shell companies with executive authorization periods. And there it was. During the exact months my father's funding vanished, Harrison's father had been undergoing medical treatment overseas. Temporary executive authority had shifted. To Vivian. Several controversial transactions, quiet, technical, devastating, were signed under her name. My pulse pounded as I stared at the digital copies. This wasn't rumor. This wasn't suspicion. It was architecture. A system built carefully enough to remain technically legal but strategically cruel. The Whitmore empire wasn't collapsing. It was cracking. But the crack ran through Harrison too. Because while I built timelines and spreadsheets at night, he drafted a proposal for an ethical oversight committee during the day. He spoke passionately about reform, about updating investment standards, about correcting historical blind spots. One evening, sitting across from me in his apartment, he said, "I think we can do better. I think we owe people more transparency." I studied his face, searching for calculation. I found none. What if transparency hurts the company? I asked softly. Then we absorb the hit, he replied. What's the point of legacy if it's built on avoidance? That was the moment the wire tightened inside me. If I exposed Vivian publicly now, I could ignite a scandal that would swallow his reform before it even began. The board would circle defensively. Investors would panic. Harrison's proposal would be labeled reckless. But if I stayed silent, the truth about my father and families like ours might be buried forever under polished mission statements. Justice or love? Exposure or evolution? Vivian sensed the tension long before Harrison did. She began speaking to him in careful tones. I overheard fragments at a charity event when she didn't realize I was close enough to listen. "You're moving quickly," she told him. "Relationships formed around wealth require scrutiny. Not everyone admires you for who you are." "I know what you're implying," Harrison said, restrained but firm. "I'm implying nothing," she replied smoothly. "I'm advising caution." The damage wasn't loud, it was surgical. Later that night, Harrison seemed distant. "You don't trust me?" I asked him directly. "That's not fair," he said. I pressed gently. He ran a hand through his hair. "It's just this is my family. They've protected this company for decades." "And from what exactly?" I asked. He didn't answer. The doubt wasn't declared, it hovered. Small, persistent. Vivian's accusation had done exactly what it was designed to do. It hadn't broken as it had introduced erosion, and erosion is patient. A week later, I learned through a regulatory filing that a closed-door board meeting had been scheduled. The agenda included restructuring proposals and risk management discussions. Harrison wasn't listed among the primary attendees. When I asked him about it, confusion flickered across his face. "That's strange," he said. "I should have been notified, but I already understood." Suspicion had shifted from emotion to strategy. Vivian wasn't trying to prove I was a gold digger anymore. She was trying to isolate Harrison from influence. And as I stared at the meeting notice on my screen, I felt something colder than anger settle into place. This wasn't about perception now. It was about control. When I saw the final line of the board agenda, executive consolidation under interim authority, I realized Vivian wasn't just defending the past. She was preparing to repeat it. The boardroom overlooked Manhattan, but the windows were covered. That detail stayed with me when I read the meeting notice again. A conference suite high above the city, glass walls facing a skyline built on ambition, and yet the blinds drawn shut during sensitive discussions. Control the light. Control the narrative. Harrison found out about the closed-door session the same way I did through a filing that didn't expect scrutiny. They said I have a conflict of interest. He told me over the phone, disbelief sharpening his voice. Because of you. Because of me. I repeated quietly. They're claiming any restructuring vote might be influenced by personal bias. Personal bias. As if legacy wasn't the deepest bias of all. What's on the agenda? I asked. He exhaled. Consolidation of rural development funds. Reallocation into a real estate acquisition initiative. Aunt Vivian says it's modernization. The words landed like Didi Vu rural funds. Acquisition initiative. The structure was identical, just rebranded. I closed my eyes and saw my father standing on courthouse steps again. Saw the signature line with Vivian's name beneath it. If that passes, I said carefully, what happens? It expands liquidity, Harrison replied. Frees up capital for long-term growth. And the communities currently relying on those funds. Silence. They'll be reviewed, he said finally. Individually. Individually meant quietly. Quietly meant disposable. When the call ended I didn't pace, I didn't cry. I opened my laptop. If the proposal passed, history would repeat under a cleaner title. And this time, I would have watched it happen. I had a choice. Remain the accused outsider who kept her head down to preserve a relationship. Or step forward and risk becoming the villain in their story. I pulled up the archive folder, dates, transfers, withdrawal notices, land absorption timelines. I built a compliance brief that mapped the previous restructuring phase to the current proposal, overlaying patterns like transparent sheets until the symmetry became undeniable. This wasn't emotional retaliation. It was structural evidence. Months earlier, anticipating something like this, I had quietly purchased minority shares through a small investment vehicle. Not enough to threaten control, enough to qualify for advisory review under governance policy. I filed the request before dawn. By noon the board's legal counsel had acknowledged it. By 3, Vivian Caldwell knew. The review session was scheduled 48 hours later. Same building. I wore navy again. When I walked into the room, conversations paused the way they had at dinner, but this time it wasn't social discomfort. It was strategic irritation. Vivian sat at the head of the table, composed as ever. This is highly irregular, she began smoothly. An advisory representative intervening at this stage suggests misaligned priorities. I believe that priorities require transparency. I replied. Her eyes flickered, not anger but recalibration. I connected my laptop to the screen without theatrics. No dramatic pauses, just data. Over a 15-month period, I began evenly. Whitmore Capital withdrew funding from 6 mid-sized rural construction firms within 90 days of project completion. Within 6 months of each withdrawal, affiliated entities acquired distressed land assets at reduced valuation. Charts appeared. Timelines, signature authorizations. I did not look at Harrison's empty chair. The proposed consolidation model mirrors that structure. I continued. The language has evolved. The mechanics have not. One board member leaned forward. Are you suggesting reputational risk? I'm suggesting pattern risk, I answered. And ethical exposure in a market environment less forgiving than it was 15 years ago. Vivian folded her hands. You're presenting selective data, she said calmly. Context matters. Then let's discuss context, I replied. I clicked to the final slide. A scanned authorization page, her signature. I was 19, I said, my voice steady but no longer detached, when one of those withdrawals forced my father's company into bankruptcy. He never received an explanation, only silence. The room shifted. No one interrupted. My father died 2 years later. I continued. Stress-related complications. We were told it wasn't personal. That it was strategic restructuring. Vivian's expression hardened. This is a personal grievance dressed as compliance review. It's documentation, I corrected softly. And it's relevant. A board member who had deferred to her earlier cleared his throat. Why were these acquisitions concentrated under interim authority? He asked. Vivian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Because leadership requires decisive action during instability. And who defined instability? Another member asked. The air changed. Not dramatically, but enough. Vivian tried once more. Harrison's involvement with you compromises perception. That alone is grounds for caution. Perception cuts both ways, I said. If this proposal passes without independent audit, the perception of repetition could cost more than reform ever would. No raised voices. Just pressure applied precisely where it belonged. The vote was postponed pending independent review. When I stepped out of the building, my phone buzzed immediately. Harrison, what did you do? He asked, not accusing, but stunned. I presented information, I said. You never told me, he murmured. You never ask laws. Then, quietly, I'm proud of you. And I'm ashamed I didn't see this sooner. I wasn't trying to humiliate your family, I said. I was trying to stop a repetition, I know, he replied. But Aunt Vivian won't take this lightly. As if summoned by the words, another message appeared on my screen. Not anonymous this time. From Vivian, you've mistaken tolerance for weakness. That will be corrected. I stared at the skyline beyond the building's glass vide, the city exposed in full daylight, no blinds, no shadows. She had underestimated me once, she wouldn't again. And the tone of that message told me something else with chilling clarity. This wasn't over. Before the independent audit could even begin, rumors about my conflict of interest started circulating through financial media, and this time, they weren't subtle. Vivian didn't respond to conflict with emotion. She responded with architecture. Within 3 days of the postponed vote, the first article appeared. It wasn't in a major publication. It was a niche financial blog, just credible enough to circulate in investment circles. Just obscure enough to avoid immediate scrutiny. The headline didn't mention me directly, but the implication was unmistakable. Minority shareholder exploits governance loopholes in personal vendetta. I read it twice. By the third paragraph, it referenced a romantic relationship with a key executive, and questioned whether legal access had been weaponized for personal retribution. My phone began vibrating before I could finish. An industry colleague texted, everything okay? Hearing strange things. Another message followed, investors asking questions. Vivian understood power in its purest form: control the narrative, control the outcome. She wasn't attacking my evidence. She was attacking my credibility. When Harrison called that evening, his voice carried strain he tried to conceal. Some of our larger investors are concerned, he said carefully. They're worried about instability tied to optics. Optics. I repeated. They're framing it as distraction, he continued. They think the board conflict looks personal. It is personal, I said quietly. It just isn't irrational, he exhaled. I know that, but they don't. That was the strategy. Never accuse directly. Just seed doubt, suggest emotional bias, suggest manipulation. Suggest the woman from Montana overstepped her place. By the end of the week, quiet inquiries were circulating to firms I had previously consulted for. Nothing aggressive, just polite emails asking about my professional boundaries. Race her by isolating her. For a moment I felt the old fear surface. The courthouse hallway. The sense of being small in systems designed to outlast you. Then it passed. Because I had anticipated escalation the second I stepped into that boardroom. Instead of responding publicly, I accelerated the audit. I contacted the independent investigators directly and provided additional archived communications I had obtained through lawful channels. Internal memos, email directives, profit breakdowns that quantified land acquisitions down to percentage margins. There was one email in particular that made my hands steady instead of shake. It was from Vivian to a regional asset manager during her interim authority period. Ensure funding withdrawal occurs before milestone certification. It read, asset recovery potential increases if liquidity collapse precedes completion. No slurs. No shouting, just language so clinical it almost disguised the harm. I forwarded it to the audit team without commentary. Days later, Harrison showed up at my apartment unannounced. He looked exhausted. They've seen the communications, he said. I didn't ask what meant. He ran a hand over his face. I confronted her. My chest tightened. And she didn't deny it, he said, voice low. She said leadership requires difficult decisions. That sentimentality is expensive. I closed my eyes briefly. She raised me, he continued. After my father got sick, she told me discipline was survival. That mercy in business destroys families, and do you believe that? I asked gently. He looked at me for a long time before answering. I don't know what I believe anymore. That fracture in his voice hurt more than any headline. The audit report was finalized 2 weeks later. It didn't accuse Vivian of illegality. It didn't dramatize. It simply concluded that prior consolidation strategies, while compliant with regulations at the time, demonstrated coordinated timing that disproportionalized smaller enterprises. It labeled the replication of such models a significant reputational hazard in contemporary markets. Reputational hazard, in Whitmore language, that was a warning flare. Board members who had once deferred automatically to Vivian B and private calls with Harrison, not to apologize, to distance. Self-preservation is a powerful motivator. Vivian requested a closed session shortly after. Her proposal was elegant. She would step down voluntarily, quietly. No public scandal. In exchange, the internal findings would remain contained, framed as generational transition rather than exposure. When Harrison relayed the offer to me, his expression was conflicted. She says this protects the family, he said. It protects her, I replied, and if the board refuses, they risk external scrutiny. I said. Because once restructuring begins, analysts will start asking why. The board chose protection through transparency rather than secrecy. Formal restructuring was initiated. Public language framed it as modernization, but internally everyone understood. For the first time in decades, Vivian was not in control of the room. I didn't feel victorious. Justice, when it's real, he doesn't cheer. It settles. That night, Harrison sat beside me on the couch in silence. I used to think loyalty meant defense, he said finally. Now I think it might mean correction. I rested my head lightly against his shoulder. Correction is harder. His phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and went still. It's her, he murmured. He stood walking toward the window before answering. I couldn't hear her words. Only his responses. No, he said quietly. Another pause. That's not fair. Longer silence. When he ended the call, his face had changed. What did she say? I asked. He swallowed. She said if I allow this restructuring to proceed publicly, she'll release us documents that prove my father approved the strategy before she executed it. The room felt suddenly smaller. She says it will redefine the narrative. He continued. That it won't just dismantle her legacy. His eyes met mine, filled with something raw and unsteady. It will dismantle my father's. And if Harrison believed for a second that his father had been complicit by choice, everything we were building, trust, reform, love, could collapse under the weight of inherited guilt. Harrison didn't sleep the night his aunt made the threat. He sat at the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor like it might rearrange itself into something easier to stand on. She says he approved it, he said finally, his voice rough from hours of silence. She says my father knew about the acquisition timing, that he signed off before his health declined. I stayed quiet. Not because I didn't have thoughts, but because timing matters when someone's foundation is cracking. She framed herself as the executor, he continued, not the architect. That word hung in the air between us. Architect. The difference between building something out someone else's blueprint is subtle. Legally, morally, emotionally. Do you believe her? I asked gently. He looked up at me, eyes unsteady. I don't know what I believe. I grew up thinking he was principled, careful. He taught me that reputation was earned, not inherited, and this would contradict that. It would complicate it, he said quietly. Complication can feel like betrayal when you've lived inside a clean narrative. The next day, Vivian sent over the documents she had threatened to release. Copies of board summaries. Authorization pages bearing Harrison's father's signature. Dates that overlapped with the early stages of the consolidation strategy. Harrison brought them to me without speaking. I spread them across the dining table and studied the timestamps carefully. And signatures were real. But so were the medical reports I had previously reviewed during timeline research records indicating his father had begun aggressive treatment overseas during that same quarter. He may have approved a framework, I said slowly, tracing dates with my finger. But these specific withdrawal accelerations happened after he stepped back operationally. Harrison watched me closely. Partial awareness isn't the same as orchestration, I continued. Complicity and control are not identical. He swallowed. But he didn't stop it. Did he know how far it would go, I asked. Or did he trust the person executing it? That question landed heavily. Vivian hadn't just defended herself, she had shifted the moral weight onto a man who could no longer respond. And onto his son. For days. Harrison moved through meetings like someone carrying invisible inheritance. Investors watched him carefully. Board members avoided prolonged eye contact. The narrative wasn't public yet, but inside the company, tension hummed. If he signed anything, Harrison said one evening, standing at the window of his office, then reforming this company means admitting my own bloodline contributed to harm. Yes, I said quietly. Does. He turned to me. And you're asking me to do that? I'm asking you to choose transparency over preservation, I replied. Silence already cost too many families stability. Including mine. The words weren't sharp. They didn't need to be. He nodded slowly, absorbing it. A week later, Harrison requested a strategy session with the board, not about defense, but about restitution. The proposal was radical for Whitmore standards. A restorative initiative. Direct reinvestment into communities affected by prior land consolidations. Financial compensation where appropriate. Infrastructure partnerships where businesses had collapsed. Public acknowledgement of restructuring impact without dramatization. When he presented it, the room shifted in the opposite direction from before. This opens liability exposure. One board member warned. It invites scrutiny. Another added. It invites integrity. Harrison replied calmly. I sat beside him, not speaking unless addressed. This wasn't my moment. It was his. Markets punish instability. Someone argued. Markets also punish concealment. He countered. The vote was tense. The proposal required majority leverage to pass. Harrison held that power but had never used it aggressively before. It had always been symbolic. An inheritance waiting patiently. He looked around the table, then said quietly, legacy isn't protection from truth. It's responsibility for it. And he exercised his majority vote. The motion passed narrowly. No applause, no dramatic exit, just a line crossed. From the margins of the room Vivian watched. Her expression didn't break, but something recalibrated behind her eyes. Exposure hadn't destroyed the Whitmore family. It had transformed its center of gravity. Afterward she approached Harrison gravelly. I remained at a distance. But I could read posture. You're dismantling what we built. She told him in a tone controlled enough to pass his concern. I'm rebuilding it. He answered. She glanced at me, then not with rage, but with calculation. You believe she's strengthening you? Vivian said quietly. She's isolating you. Harrison didn't hesitate this time. No, he replied. She's forcing me to see. That was the inversion. The woman once accused of chasing wealth was now redirecting it. I didn't feel vindicated, I felt tired. Later that night, Harrison sat beside me. Quieter but steadier than he had been all week. I used to think loving you meant protecting you from my family, he said. Now I think loving you means protecting the people they hurt. Emotion rose in my throat, unexpected and sharp. This was never about revenge, I whispered. I know, he said. It was about repair. The restorative initiative was drafted formally the next morning. But one critical component remained unresolved. Public acknowledgement, because restitution without admission is just another transaction, and admitting harm meant reopening cases. Recalling families. Naming timelines that had been carefully archived and forgotten. The Whitmore name had survived generations by controlling exposure. Now, exposure was the only path forward. If Harrison stood before investors and acknowledged that Whitmore Capital's past strategies had destabilized real families, the backlash wouldn't just target the company, it would test whether love and legacy could survive public truth. The statement went live in 9 am. I watched it appear on Whitmore Capital's official website from Harrison's office, my hands folded tightly in my lap. The language had been revised a dozen times, balanced, deliberate, impossible to misinterpret. Whitmore Capital announced internal restructuring, a restorative investment initiative, a formal review of prior consolidation strategies and their long-term community impact. It did not use the word harm lightly. Within hours, financial media outlets began tracing the announcement back to archived controversies. Old regional reports resurfaced. Local news clips about collapsed construction firms. Rural development projects that had stalled mid-foundation. My father's company wasn't named, but it was there in the pattern. Harrison insisted on stepping forward himself. "You don't owe anyone your story," he told me the night before the press conference. "This is my name, my responsibility." I nodded. "Then carry it fully." He stood behind a simple podium in a room filled with cameras that fed into markets, analysts, and critics. I watched from a private monitor in a separate office. Not hiding, just refusing spectacle. Whitmore Capital implemented strategies in the past that prioritized asset recovery over community stability, Harrison said, voice steady. While compliant with regulatory standards at the time, those strategies contributed to outcomes that harmed small businesses. He didn't blame former leadership. He didn't say circumstances were complex. He didn't minimize. We cannot build a responsible future without acknowledging the impact of our history. He continued. The room was silent in the way rooms only become silent when truth enters them. Questions followed, sharp, skeptical, measured. "Are you admitting legal wrongdoing?" "No," Harrison answered calmly. "We are acknowledging moral oversight." That distinction mattered. When the conference ended, the headlines were predictable but not catastrophic. Whitmore Hair confronts company's past. Legacy firm announces restorative plan. Corporate accountability or strategic rebrand. The skepticism was fair. Over the next few weeks, compensation packages were issued, not settlements. Acknowledgements. Letters were sent to former business owners offering partnership opportunities, infrastructure grants, and equity collaboration on new regional projects. I received a copy of one such letter addressed to my father's estate. My name, printed under Whitmore Capital's crest. I didn't open it immediately. I held it in my hands and felt the weight of 15 years inside that envelope. When I finally unfolded it, the language was formal but direct. An acknowledgement of destabilization. An invitation to reinvestment. A structured financial restoration proposal. No apology can return lost time. But dignity can be restored. The narrative began to shift. Financial analysts who initially predicted investor backlash started noting the strategic foresight of proactive transparency. Market stability held. Share prices dipped briefly, then steadied. From scandal to reform, Vivian watched from isolation. Her resignation had been announced quietly. Her social calendar shrank. Invitations slowed. The same people who once deferred to her now spoke of necessary evolution. She wasn't publicly disgraced. She was simply displaced. At a family gathering weeks later, the tension was quieter but no less sharp. One cousin avoided eye contact entirely. Another murmured that I had disrupted generational comfort. I met that comment evenly. Comfort built on silence doesn't last. Across the room, an older relative approached me privately. "You did what no one else would," he said softly. "That takes courage." Resentment and respect coexisted in the same air. Harrison found me later that evening standing alone on the balcony. "You okay?" he asked. "I'm processing," I said. He stepped beside me. The city stretching below in calm indifference. "They see the outcome," he said. "They don't see what it cost." "That's fine," I replied. This was never about visibility. He reached into his jacket pocket then, his movements deliberate but not theatrical. "For a long time," he said, "I thought love meant defending someone from the world. But you didn't need defense. You needed alignment." He held out a small velvet box, not grand, not staged. "I don't want this to feel like a victory lap," he continued. "I want it to feel like recognition of what we survived, of what we rebuilt." My throat tightened unexpectedly. "You're sure?" I asked quietly. "I've never been more certain of anything," he said. There were no cameras. No applause. Just resilience meeting resilience. I said yes. The public never learned the full depth of my original motivation. They didn't know about the courthouse hallway. The anonymous threats. The photo of Vivian standing near my father during his final professional collapse. They saw only a corporation recalibrated by conscience. Sometimes that's enough. But late one night, weeks after restitution began, I reopened the audit files not because I doubted the progress, but because something unsettled me. One of the shell entities involved in earlier land acquisitions had recently transferred assets again, this time into a private trust unaffiliated with Whitmore Capital's public restructuring. The name listed under Beneficiary Advisory Authority wasn't Vivian. It was unfamiliar. And the transaction date was recent. Restitution had begun. Transparency had been declared. But systems built over decades rarely dissolve in a single press conference. I stared at the document longer than I meant to. Had justice truly been achieved? Or had it merely been negotiated into a more acceptable shape? Because if the architecture of silence had simply shifted owners instead of collapsing entirely, then everything we had fought for might still be standing on an unstable foundation. Years passed, and Whitmore Capital no longer operated the way it once had. The revised ethical charter wasn't decorative language buried in annual reports. It required transparent community partnerships, third-party oversight, and publicly accessible impact assessments. Rural investment projects were no longer evaluated solely by return margins, but by sustainability metrics and long-term stability outcomes. Harrison often credited the transformation to board evolution. When speaking at conferences, he framed it as generational modernization, market adaptation, structural maturity. But in private, he never romanticized it. It started the night she called you a gold digger. He told a small leadership retreat once. Unaware I was standing just outside the doorway. That was the first crack. He didn't say my name in that moment, he didn't need to. The accusation that once threatened to shrink me had expanded everything instead. I never wanted revenge. Revenge is loud. It burns quickly and leaves nothing standing. What I wanted was recognition of harm, of patterns, of preventable collapse. My father's name appeared in the first round of restorative acknowledgments not as a statistic, but as a builder whose contracts had been destabilized during restructuring. The official record described him as a respected regional contractor whose work contributed to long-term community development. I read that sentence more than once. The compensation that followed did not bring him back. It did not restore the years he spent unraveling under financial pressure. But it restored something quieter. Dignity. We used a portion of the funds to establish a regional apprenticeship program for small town contractors, young builders who needed backing, but not exploitation. Harrison insisted the program remain independent from Whitmore branding. This isn't marketing, he said. It's correction. Vivian lived quietly after her resignation. She wasn't publicly disgraced. No dramatic takedowns. Her authority simply dissolved the way fog lifts when light insists on staying. We saw her occasionally at family functions, composed, observant, diminished but not bitter in the way I once expected. One evening, long after the restructuring had stabilized, she asked to speak with me privately. We stood in a library room lined with photographs of past Whitmore leadership. Generations of certainty framed in gold. I underestimated you, she said without preface. That wasn't difficult, I replied calmly. A faint smile flickered across her face. I operated from fear, she continued. Markets were ruthless, competitors aggressive. I believed consolidation was survival. At whose expense? I asked. She didn't look away. Those without leverage. There was no apology in her tone. But there was acknowledgement. I told myself it wasn't personal. She added quietly. That families like yours would recover. We didn't, I said. Silence settled between us, not hostile, just honest. I wasn't greedy, she said after a moment. I was afraid. I studied her then, not the executive, not the strategist, just a woman who had equated control with protection. I understand fear, I said. I grew up inside its consequences. She nodded slowly. As if that was the closest thing to reconciliation we would ever have. The irony never escaped me. The woman once dismissed as a gold digger had never been digging for wealth. I had been digging for accountability. For documentation. For the quiet acknowledgement that silence is not neutrality, it's permission. Harrison and I built a life that was less about inheritance and more about intention. We disagreed sometimes about risk tolerance, about speed of reform, but never about direction. the family that once questioned my motives began consulting me on compliance initiatives. Not because they suddenly admired me, but because clarity became valuable once comfort dissolved. Whitmore Capital survived. But it survived differently. The empire that once operated in silence now functioned under scrutiny. Internal audits were routine. Community advisory panels had real authority. Transparency wasn't a threat anymore, it was infrastructure. Still, I never forgot the document I found years ago, the quiet transfer of assets into a private trust after restitution began. That thread had led to another investigation, one that revealed a network of external partners, who had benefited indirectly from earlier consolidations. Not illegal, not overtly malicious, but opportunistic. We addressed it systematically. Reform, I learned, is not a moment, it is maintenance. Sometimes I think back to that first dinner, the crystal chandeliers, the measured smiles, the accusation delivered like etiquette. If Vivian had never called me a gold digger, perhaps I would have remained cautious but distant. Perhaps I would have chosen love over confrontation, but accusation clarified intention. It forced proximity, it demanded proof, and in doing so, it exposed architecture that had been mistaken for legacy. Harrison once asked me, late one night as we reviewed another annual transparency report, if they hadn't pulled your father's funding, would you have ever stepped into this world? I considered the question carefully. No, I said. But then neither would the reform. He studied me for a long moment. You changed the trajectory of this company. I shook my head gently. No. The company changed when it was forced to see itself. We stood together at the window of our home overlooking a skyline, built on ambition, risk, and reinvention. The dinner that drew blood without a knife had become the origin story of corporate redemption. Not because of scandal, but because someone refused to accept silence. And sometimes, the person accused of wanting everything is the only one willing to rebuild what was broken. The question was never whether I loved a Whitmore. The real question was whether a Whitmore could love the truth more than the comfort of his name, and that answer continues to shape everything that follows.